Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Foundation Source webinar, Building a Philanthropic Legacy with a Family Foundation. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So if you have any questions throughout today's discussion, please type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar. And if we don't have time to get to your question, please know we're going to follow up with you. Closed captioning can be enabled by clicking Show Captions in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to your email tomorrow. So let's get started. I'm Robin Houlihan, Senior Philanthropic Director of Foundation Source's Philanthropic Advisory Services, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Shana Varricchio, Foundation Source's National Director of Legal Services. John and I will be sharing a conversation about how a family foundation can be a meaningful way to manifest a philanthropic vision, and how, in an ever-changing environment, a philanthropist can build a legacy that lasts through generations. We'll discuss the legal considerations and strategic approaches that family foundation leaders consider in building their philanthropic legacy, and touch on topics such as perpetuity, next-gen engagement, preparing future leaders, and communication tools. So to get us started, Jana, could you briefly explain what a philanthropic legacy is? What exactly is it that we're building toward in our conversation today?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Robin. And welcome, everyone. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. It always is when Robin and I have a chance to chat. And just, from the perspective of why is legal here? Why are there legal considerations? This is something beautiful that I want to build with my philanthropy. There's so much overlap and intertwined connectivity between planning from a strategic perspective and the compliance that hums in the background. So it's very often the case that members of the compliance groups get the opportunity and the pleasure of collaborating with Robin and the other members of the philanthropic advisory team here to really give a holistic support to anyone that we have questions from. And with that, a legacy. What is a legacy? And at the risk of outing myself as a theater nerd, a quote from Hamilton really does sum it up beautifully. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. So I take a small issue with this because I think that there are ways to start your legacy now. But overall, legacy can mean so many different things depending on, your perspective and your individual circumstances. It can be something as grand as leaving a mark so significant that your name is remembered throughout society. It can be coming together with other like-minded people to preserve something or a tradition of cultural, historical, artistic significance. Not necessarily to preserve your reputation, but to keep this important touchstone available for future generations. It can be something as, close to home as family tradition. I come from a long line of philanthropists, and I would like my children to know the same, is a powerful motivator. And, molding members of the younger generation more broadly, even if you don't have young people in your family ever or yet, there's a whole generation of young people hungry for advice and mentorship and guidance. And that can be your legacy as a philanthropist, imparting the wisdom and experience that you've had on future generations. And for many people that have this innovation, this spirit of discovery, one lifetime isn't enough to get everything done. So passing down your inspiration, your passion projects through a philanthropic vehicle like a family foundation can really give people the freedom to take on large, monumental, shifting projects.
Thanks, Shana. That leaves a wide range of ideas for a foundation to develop a legacy building strategy.
Oh,
So you
yes.
gave us a real breadth there. Thank you. In order to construct a roadmap for foundation leaders to establish this plan for giving and for future generations to continue the course, let's talk about some of the core components to consider when building your philanthropic legacy. So, for example, building a legacy implies perpetuity, right? In fact, one of the first questions that I ask newly established foundation board members is, are you planning the foundation to exist in perpetuity, or do you anticipate an endpoint at some moment in time? And a good majority of the foundations choose to exist in perpetuity. But for those who are devoted to a particular purpose, and to family engagement, next gen engagement, of course, the challenge that many of these foundations discover is, how do you ensure perpetuity? So I'm thinking of founders of a particular foundation right now who are deeply committed to leaving a meaningful philanthropic legacy.
Mhm.
And they asked us to help structure a foundation that not only reflects their interest today, but um, that the foundation would really thrive for generations to come. And we help the founders and their adult children align with some planning pillars. So plan for a governance structure, for example, and a giving focus, of course. But where to start? I mean, there's so many components, right? Where we start is with a clear articulation of the founder's philanthropic vision and their values, which is something that you touched on earlier. And that's what I think is the North Star for perpetuity. We embed that vision, those values in the founding documents. So, for example, mission statement,
Mhm.
a statement of values, even a letter of donor intent. But we need to allow room for evolution. And so we also might draft a purpose clause that's broad enough to accommodate shifting community needs over time. So I'm curious what comes to mind for you on the topic of perpetuity.
Sure. I mean, many things, and I will add to the, talking about the values and the purpose and what, the foundation hopes to accomplish. I would say another element that I try to get clients to think about when I'm talking about these issues is why? Why perpetuity? There's no wrong or right answer. A foundation that's designed to exist for a specific period of time is no better or worse than a foundation that is intended to last forever. So it's, to me, very enlightening to know why. Why do you want this foundation to exist forever into the future? Which can kind of inform how you think about making that a reality. Because I find that when clients want a foundation to exist in amber, as it is now, unchangeable forever and ever, first of all, there's a level of disappointment if they are a corporate foundation that when people find out that you can put in place whatever restrictions you would like in the governing documents, but future boards and officers will have the same rights and abilities that the current set of officers and directors have. So future board members will have the discretion and, in fact, the responsibility to act in the best interest of the foundation and either continue apace or shift focus. And even for foundations that are set up as a trust, which has a lot more ability for restriction and um, structure that is harder to change, you can still petition the courts and make your argument that this purpose is no longer, what it once was, and it's not in the best interest of the public and the charitable purpose to maintain what has been put in place before. And one example that I like to use as a good bad outcome to encourage people to really think with an open mind about how strict they would like to make the parameters on the foundation and its purpose is a foundation that I was speaking with about the restrictions that their trust mission put on them. The foundation was established many years ago for the sole purpose of funding research and outreach to prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS from pregnant mothers to their babies during the course of pregnancy and birth. Obviously, in the 80s and the early 90s, this was a huge problem facing the medical community. people are not going to experiment on pregnant women. So it was a very challenging thing for a problem to solve for, but it was solved for. So now there is no more need for research into how do we prevent this. We know. So the foundation found itself kind of handcuffed and unable to operate within its mission, but there's no mission to further. So, I mean, we should have such problems that every single problem in society is solved, and we have to think of something new to work on, but you want to leave that door open so that your foundation continues to be relevant.
Shauna, is there a way to put names of the grantees in incorporation documents so that the legacy might continue in that way?
Yes and no. I mean, again, for a trust, there's a lot more flexibility for the grantor to the trust to establish pretty, solid requirements. For a corporate entity, again, if you just put it in the bylaws, it's operable as long as those bylaws are the current version. But future boards can vote to amend, can vote to adjust, can make those changes. Um, One way that clients can find a middle ground, a compromise, is the idea of restricted contributions. So you have this foundation that is designed to exist into perpetuity, and the vast majority of the assets will be free to kind of evolve and ebb and flow with the rest of the foundation. But if you make a certain portion of your gift into your foundation restricted to either a particular cause or to particular organizations, provided that they maintain their tax exempt status. Those funds will need to be maintained separately. They are accounted for in a way that tracks the original assets, any gains or interests or dividends or anything that's gained. And all of that would be reserved for whatever purpose was close to the heart of the donor, while still allowing the rest of the foundation's assets to be deployed in a way that makes sense for the current incarnation of the foundation's leadership.
Thank you. So another core component in building a philanthropic legacy is about family participation. We see that every day, right?
Mhm.
Particularly where there's multi-generational engagement. There are many parts of this topic that are important for us to explore. For example, we work with family foundations to define so many pieces of this. For example, who constitutes family? Um, as this legacy continues, is it going to be bloodline only, spouses, extended family? How will they work together over time as they grow, or perhaps the foundation family might diminish through generations. So how is that going to look? You have
So
to
I'm actually very
think that
interested to
ahead.
hear how you look at this in practice, because I've had conversations from the perspective of reviewing documents and seeing what people are envisioning and then
Mhm.
calling out what could happen with the best of intentions down the line. And, for example, let's say you want to be very inclusive and future in-laws and children and all of these things are, in your definition of family. What happens when you have three kids and two of them get married and one of them doesn't, and one of them has eight kids and one of them has two and one of them has none, and everybody starts to feel some kind of way about how much of a voice they have in
That's
foundation
right.
governance?
That's right. There has to be an understanding that we can only go so far. Things might shift. So we have to keep things as open as possible, right?
Hmm.
Make a governance structure that is broad enough to be able to foresee the next generation or two down the line, but leave it open for those generations to then make decisions when the time comes, because one line may disappear. And that's something that we don't know about in the next 25, 30 plus years or so. It's something, though, that we need to make available to us to think about, to have an opening to be able to shift. And that's one of the reasons why it isn't so necessarily great to prescribe every detail for your legacy. It's important to leave some openings so that you can prepare for these moments when the components of the governance, for example, might shift. We do have a lot of ideas that we bring to the table for how we can keep things broad. For example, we might create different models of engagement. So we might have advisory committees or a junior board to slowly bring members up through the ranks. Maybe governance positions might have rotating seats, so there's no pressure for everybody to be on the
Mhm.
board all the time. The voting structure needs to be looked at because if a family's growing exponentially, voting can get quite out of hand.
Yes.
So what's that going to look like? We need to leave some options open for that. And where the foundation lands, it has, as we're saying, has a lot to do with their size, the ages of the children that are coming up through the ranks, the skills that they have, what kind of experience they have in philanthropy and nonprofit work. And also the decision making of the style of the board is even an important component, right? Because
Yeah.
there's some where we've got the founder makes the decisions, and even though children are on the board, they say, okay, that sounds great. And then when it's their turn to lead, ooh, they need to be ready for that. So I'm curious about legal documentation,
Ah,
um,
yeah.
bylaws, for example, or anything else that comes to mind where you can build in that definition, and how far do you go?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I echo your earlier recommendations about leaving room for growth and evolution.
Mhm.
I always tell clients you want to avoid the nitty-gritty minutia in your bylaws because then, just from a practical standpoint, you have to change them and amend them formally every single time you make a change, which can be cumbersome, and then version control gets a little unruly as well. So I always say that broad strokes outlines of parameters that can be helpful gives you options. So like the bylaws that are part of the governing structure for the foundations that we help set up, they make allowance for advisory committees, non-voting affiliates. And it's a very broad term by design because you can use that to mean many things, all within the same foundation or between foundations can interpret it differently. Junior boards, advisory boards, grant recommendation committees, program focus committees, and they can be permanent, they can be rotating, they can serve a purpose and then be retired temporarily. It's really flexible, and all of that can be fleshed out in current policy documents or, the year forward statement at the end of the prior year at your board meeting. It can be done in ways that incorporate it into operational documents. One suggestion that we often discuss with clients is about how do you make your decisions? Because right now it's mom and dad at the dining room table. But to your point, when the next generation is in charge of making decisions, if you want to increase the chances of them making decisions that you would agree with, teaching them your methodology for assessing different options and what factors and criteria you look for can be very informative for young people that are, trying to learn. And it's not I want you to do this. It's, I'm teaching you how to do this. It's entirely up to you.
Exactly. So that's why early training is just so unbelievably important, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And we do a lot of this with our work at Foundation Source. Some family foundation leaders, they incorporate the discussion of philanthropy throughout their children's lives.
Yeah.
I'm always in awe of how many families bring up philanthropy at the dinner table with their young children. Families do volunteer activities together. As children get older, they might be given the opportunity to recommend a grant. Um, Foundation Source has online grant certificates, which is something to encourage that, where we have that as essentially a digital gift certificate
Those are such
for,
an
isn't
elegant
that
tool.
great?
People would think that I make a commission. I suggest it so many times. I do not. But it's a really nice way to incorporate more people
Right.
in with guidelines, with parameters, and also at an age appropriate level. We do want to encourage families to bring their children up in this atmosphere and this culture of philanthropy. But on the flip side, you want to make sure that you're not jeopardizing the foundation's good standing and compliance by having the foundation pay expenses or do things that are outside of the scope of what is considered permissible.
Right.
It's a tricky balance to find because the family foundation is 100% designed and intended to make philanthropy something that brings people together and allows you to live your values as a family through philanthropy in a formal structure. But it's also a corporate entity that has its own legal existence, and the people that are responsible for shepherding it forward, i.e., board members, foundation officers, etc., they have an obligation to make decisions that are in the best interest of the foundation. And taking away for just a moment our feelings about our children, because I think mine are just the best ever. But they're 7 and 5, and their ability to meaningfully participate in decisions about philanthropy or benefit the foundation, hypothetically, in any way, is limited. And the IRS has made note of this and said that, you absolutely can expose your children to these things through your foundation, but we need to be mindful of what the foundation is picking up the bill for until they reach an age that their work is meaningfully benefiting the foundation. And honestly, I think it's actually younger than people would expect because, especially now, things are moving at such a pace that the problems that will be, central and must be solved in 5 years, we don't even know what they are yet. And young people are the first ones to experience the effects of them and identify them and care about them, and inviting them to bring that experience and that perspective to the foundation has real value.
Right. Yeah, it's extraordinary when their voices are included
Mhm.
as the foundation finds its way with what it's going to address. But then there's other foundations. That's not the only norm out there.
Mhm.
There's other families that do not discuss philanthropy with the next generation, with their future children, with their children, grandchildren, etc. They, in fact, might not even tell them they had a foundation. We certainly have clients that have inherited a foundation and didn't know anything about it.
Yes.
So that's not unusual. So again, training, so critical. Or at that example that we were talking about earlier, where mom and dad were making the decisions and we all sat at the table, but as the torch was passed, we didn't know what to do
Mhm.
after it was our turn to lead. So how does that work? And no matter what the age, Foundation Source works with many families at all ages in training on what is philanthropy. And we have um, many options for how that might look. So it could start with an observational model. So shadowing, attending board meetings, reviewing the minutes, being an apprentice director or apprentice officer.
Mhm.
And then it might morph into a little bit more of an engaged role, a little more project oriented. So it could be where the next generation is invited for proposal review and preparing site visit summaries. They're being supervised and trained by the board, by officers at all the time. For example, they might be writing the minutes for the meeting alongside the secretary. Um, this is activity that's supervised by, if not board members, a third party, like Foundation Sources Philanthropic Advisory Services, for example. That's something that we do all the time.
Mhm.
But then finally, it's preparing them for that decision-making role, that active authority to lead. And with that ongoing learning still built in, we recommend having periodic meetings with subject matter experts, for example, and still staying on top of how to run a foundation efficiently, effectively, and transparently and in compliance, and also in touch with the community that you're serving.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not everybody goes all the way with engagement. That's another thing to
No,
think about.
that's very true. And I think one other thing that, we are kind of talking around and I want to acknowledge is that,
Mhm.
this is all well and good for you and I to sit here and talk about. And it's all very, theoretical and, you need to make plans and you need to have structure. But at the end of the day, when there is conflict or uncertainty or
Mm,
disagreement about the direction of a foundation, the existence of a foundation, the causes and values that people want to support and believe are the best use of foundation funds, it's not just a, abstract academic difference of opinion. In many cases, it can be a very personal and fraught situation because these are
mm,
not strangers. These are not people that you're even just, friendly colleagues with. This is your family. And for better or worse, family dynamics are, you know, ever moving and can be very easy to navigate one day and very challenging the next. And there can be an unpredictability about it and an irrationality that is totally human and understandable. So we have situations where, foundations were designed to last forever. And now you're down to, generations five, six, seven. And that's so far removed from the generation that created the family's wealth. And in many cases, the wealth has been significantly diluted because we are how many generations down. And it starts to feel to some of the family members like this foundation is a burden because I have to do this, I have to do that, and there's so many of us and we have to have this board meeting and it's cumbersome. Or they start to feel possibly resentful. Like, why is so much of our family wealth tied up in this foundation instead of having been passed down through the generations? And, obviously, again, early exposure and inclusion in the conversations about the family's commitment to giving, the reasons for the philanthropy can be, very helpful navigating those conversations. But I'd be interested to hear a little bit about what happens when you find yourself trying to mediate those kind of discussions.
yeah, and I have to add one more piece in talking about that training part is that what we hear a lot of times is, I don't have any time.
Mm-hmm.
The next generation that is usually taking a leadership position is really busy with life. They're just growing in their careers, they're starting their families, they're finishing extended schooling, whatever it is, they've got a lot going on. And so we might not just be navigating differences of opinion, but also differences of an ability to commit.
Yeah.
So again, it's a lot about building in enough range of options that there's room to grow here in whatever direction individuals feel that they're growing. So some might not have time. And
Mm-hmm.
so let's give them things that they can do to be a part of this and to stay involved, but in a smaller way. And let's think of ways to grow for others who do have time, for others to grow in their role and take on that leadership. And then when you've got, as you described, those differences,
Mm-hmm.
that's when kind of the rubber hits the road with, oh boy, what are we going to do now? I don't agree with what this legacy is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying earlier, things can be changed at some point,
Right.
unfortunately. So what I like to start with is building in first some kind of strong understanding of what those founders were thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Just what were you thinking? What were your motivations? What were your values? What got you going in this direction in the first place? Show the vision and the passion and the direction that you were hoping for. It doesn't mean that it's a directive, but it's helping those, as you said, the fourth, fifth generation down. It's helping them to really um, understand what these reins are that are being handed over to them before the training even begins. Who were these people that gave us this incredible opportunity to give back to the world? So I'd love to just touch on briefly before we get into dynamics and all sorts of other things, but about archiving and
Yes.
storytelling. Um, about preserving the founder's intent and the family's philanthropic journey. I work right now with a family foundation that's in its fifth generation. They did not know the founders. There are some fourth generation that actually did. They were very young, but they did. And they were very fortunate to have been given lots of material that they are
Mhm.
educated on from a young age, to understand the goals of the founders. And they kind of, because of these documents and these stories that they tell, they have family circles where they tell stories about the
Mhm.
founders. And so it's not all in writing necessarily, it's handed down. But we do like to see things done like, video testimonials and things like that, any kind of written word, photographs, any kind of memorabilia, and any language in any form that can bring a personality to this foundation of the moment that
Yeah.
it began.
Yeah, I think that one of the nice things about the private family foundation, which, we talk a lot about the what you give up when you're going into a foundation atmosphere. And, there are the rules and the restrictions and the IRS code and regulations that you have to be mindful of. And they're all designed by the IRS to remind you that the money is not yours anymore. Technically, it is in your foundation, but it is separate and distinct from your personal identity, and there are things that it just can't be used for anymore. And that's the bad side of the coin, if you want to call it that. But the good side, I feel like, far outweighs those, restrictions, because you do get to unilaterally, as a family, design and implement and direct this charitable vehicle in the way that you feel is meaningful and that you feel passionate about. And if something's working, you can do more of it. And if something is not having the impact that you want it to, you can change focus and not have to ask for permission from, an independent board and all of these, hoops. You have compliance hoops, but you have less hoops on the other side of the conversation. And I worked with a foundation client that's been around for, gosh, probably 65, 70 years now at this point. And a number of years ago, they were celebrating a milestone anniversary. And instead of doing the rubber chicken dinner and the, black tie and invite all the people and have speeches, they did basically like an on-site for a weekend in the community where the grandparents who had started the foundation were from and where their philanthropic journey started.
Nice
And
idea.
they hosted a volunteer event with the very first grantee of the foundation when it first got started. And
I
the
love it.
family was there, even family members that were not really particularly involved directly with the foundation. They came, they did the volunteer event, and then the weekend was spent with all the grantees from over the years that were in the surrounding areas coming, meeting each other, telling stories about their interaction with the foundation back when grandma and grandpa were running the show. And it was just this all inclusive, like, community that was formed because of their connection back to this one couple who had a family and was fortunate and successful, and they decided to build this legacy going forward. And it was really just such a nice thing to see that people were engaging with the community and listening to the needs and recognizing and respecting and honoring the legacy of what their grandparents started, not by, formal, required deference or anything like that, but by genuine engagement and appreciation for the work that they did and a genuine desire to want to continue, especially once they heard what their grandparents meant to this community.
Yeah.
It was so easy for them to say, well, we would never turn our backs on these, original five grantees, because it was so important and it's where we got our start. And you can't impose that on somebody. Like, you could try, but it's not going to be as genuine or authentic as when you come to it by your own discovery.
That's a fantastic example of being an example for others, right? And
Yeah.
and sharing the history, but also preparing the future. I think that's fantastic. One of the, that's a perfect example of a communication tool in action,
Yep.
right? To answer, you asked a question earlier about what happens when you have those families where one generation or some that are coming up to leadership roles say, I don't really agree with this legacy. This is not the direction I want to take it. What do we do with that?
Mhm.
One of the ways that we might prepare for that is to set up some funding guidelines. And that's can be, again, something that's loose or very specific.
Mhm.
But we, as time passes, like to have that document as flexible as it can be to allow for shifts in whether it's the needs of the community or the interests of the board. And an example that might be a little bit outside, but it's a foundation that gives to just one particular site. They are located in a city that they are devoted to and have been for generations.
Mhm.
But what started happening third generation, and it's happening in the fourth, they're moving away. And they're not just moving away locally, they're moving away across the country and over the pond. They're in other countries now, and they're moving along. So that geographical focus that was in the guidelines, oh my goodness, what do we do with that?
Mhm.
So yes, you could broaden the guidelines to say, okay, let's specify different geographical areas, or let's pick topics. We're focusing on the healthcare needs in a specific city. Perhaps we should broaden healthcare needs to what's happening in the country.
Mhm.
Are there ways to look at the guidelines where you can broaden or start with that? Just build room for growth, for variation, and understanding that the strategies might need to change over time. And it's a good idea to help that next generation weather that. So it's not a combative situation where it's, I want this and you're not allowing it.
Mhm.
Think about ways to compromise the situation even before it shows up.
See, and I love that you just said that because it leads very nicely to the next idea that I had on this topic.
Mm,
Um, what is the tone? What is the result? What is the overall feeling around succession planning in your foundation? I feel like is a very important thing for people to be honest with themselves about. Does the conversation of what happens when usually end up in productive conversations where people are sharing ideas and have thoughts, and there's give and take, and there's still things to be worked out, but everyone is coming in good faith and is really committed to making one cohesive vision work?
mhm,
Or is it really a challenging conversation that brings up negative emotions, that ends up getting heated, that is you're at impasses at every turn? If that's the case, um, sometimes it's just the case that you are not going to find common ground, and
right,
interests and priorities have diverged such that there is no reconciling them.
right,
Sometimes planning for a different future is not a sign of defeat or failure or dysfunction. It's just an acknowledgement of where everyone is, and it takes a little bit of pressure off of the players so that they have the freedom and the ability to make good decisions. So I worked with a foundation, multiple foundations actually, that were the result of a central family foundation deciding that after generation two, they were not going to try to keep everybody in the same bubble. And the plan was always to divide out the funds into separate foundations for the family lines, because it just was so apparent to the founders that their three children had such diverging interests. They had one child that was so incredibly focused on education, and they thought that that was the primary focus that the foundation should be funding, and that was going to be the silver bullet to all of the world's problems. The middle child was much more focused on the faith-based giving that their parents had been involved in, and they wanted to continue down that path. And that was something that was of great priority to them. And then the third child was completely on the opposite side of the spectrum. They, were not interested in funding faith-based giving. They felt like that had enough support, and they wanted to fund research into orphan diseases and, scientific research into slightly less mainstream purposes, funding discovery for discovery's sake, basically. And those three things were just very much at odds. Yes, there are overlaps. There are, Christian universities that have research programs, and there are parochial schools that, fund education for young people. But by and large, there was just no, no coming to terms with something that was going
Right,
to feel good to everyone.
right,
So instead of trying to make it work, only to have to go their separate ways eventually, that was baked into the plan. So while the foundation was one cohesive unit, they were able to enjoy the time as a family and do the things that, made their parents happy and learn about philanthropy in a, real-time environment. And then when the time came, everything was divided out and people had the ability to then develop their own missions and pursue their own priorities, which was, the right solution for this group of people.
right, right. You've really got to be able to customize. And that brings up another way to think about this. I like to look at the budget.
Yeah.
And don't we all?
Yeah.
I like to look at that budget and see what are our options here for working together in the future. So if the budget was at one point a very cohesive, legacy-driven giving budget, and now it seems to be diverging. We've got other interests at the table, and they're in
Mhm.
decision-making mode as well. How do we work with that budget? And so there are ways before separating is to just make buckets, I call them.
Mhm.
And so you've got your legacy bucket, but you've also got that discretionary bucket that allows the next generation to focus on their priorities. But there's also still preserved the legacy grant making that honors the founders of the foundation so
Mhm.
that you've got two things happening at the same time, hopefully complementing one another, but they don't necessarily have to. It's discretionary is often we call it the release valve when
Mhm.
there's diverging interests. And I find it can be very effective to help a family get through that period of discovering that they want to go a different direction, but they don't necessarily want to separate the foundation. They don't want to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater with the legacy giving. They want to continue to honor that. So it's a good way to again find some middle ground
Yep.
that works.
No, I
Um,
mean that's a very important thing to do is to come to your philanthropy with a healthy dose of humility, knowing that, there are going to be other perspectives and this is part of existing into perpetuity, is
right,
acknowledging that you may not have all of the answers or even know what all of the questions are going to be, a generation into the future. So,
right, right.
um,
Another thing that we touched on briefly, we were talking about values and mission statement and all that, that I just wanted to throw in there was sometimes where the foundation is going according to the plan of the founders. It really is showing itself manifesting as a legacy toward to its origin. It's always good, even though it looks like if things are moving along just swimmingly. It's good to have that review
mhm.
and build that in. And I don't know if you can build that into, if it's a good idea to build that into legal documents, but build in some sort of periodic mission review every 10 to 15 years to make sure you're at par with what the needs are in the community.
Oh, you're being
Um,
very generous with your 10 to 15 years recommendation. I would say that every time the foundation
Bump it up.
has their annual board meeting and is doing their granting budget, it doesn't have to be a formal mission review, but a quick,
Right,
show of hands, nose count. Is everybody still feeling good? Is everybody
right,
still feeling like we're doing the work that we want to be doing and that our foundation was, founded to do?
right,
Because, just because you're giving money away doesn't necessarily mean you're accomplishing the things that you hope to with those gifts. And so, along with impact review and impact measurement and, grantee relationship modeling and review and maintenance and all of those things, I think the mission needs to be central to that? And do we have the resources that we need? Do we have, the time and dedication from all of the players that we need to really maximize our impact? Sometimes the answer is, yep, we're doing great. And sometimes the answer is, no, actually, now that you mention it, we really do need to rethink some things. Um, and, one of the things that can kind of come out of nowhere is what happens if there is nobody to take over your foundation? We've talked a lot about what happens when we have,
Yeah.
exponential family growth, but what happens if, you come down to the end of a family line, or you have many children and absolutely none of them is interested in doing this foundation work. It just does not speak to them. They have other priorities and they've chosen to focus their attention elsewhere. What happens? Are you comfortable with the foundation being transitioned to unrelated people, people that are active in the same causes that you are, a trusted friend, neighbor, acquaintance, colleague, whatever? Or, you know, in that case, would you be more comfortable with your foundation winding down operations rather than pass to someone else to direct and control? And if you do have, a comfort level with basically, strangers coming in to run your foundation at some point, because, down the line, even if you know the first group that you put in place, there will eventually be people you didn't know. What does that look like? Is
Mhm.
it, a very restrictive final gift where, you're reserving this money for particular purposes? Is it trusting in the intentions and, skills of the people you appointed will have and hopefully continue to have? What does that look like?
Yeah, we've certainly worked with such a range of foundations that are grappling with this. So there's the foundation that I worked with where the um, it was a sole director who passed away and had worked very closely for her entire life with this group of attorneys who she entrusted with
Mhm.
spending down the foundation upon her death. She directed within 10 years. And so we worked with them to help them to do that. And she was very specific with them of what her wishes were, how
Mhm.
those grants were going to look, to what kind of giving focus, what size of grant, how impactful she wanted that. She was very specific. There are others who want to give while living and do all their giving while
Mhm.
living and sunset during their lifetime. And then there's, as you mentioned, the non-family board. We've certainly been working with boards that have individuals who might be experts in the field. They're not family members, but they are experts in what that founder wanted the legacy to be. And so they entrust those experts to continue the legacy in that way. It might be merging with another foundation who's of like-minded
Mhm.
goals and desire for impact in the same focus area. So there's a lot of different ways to consider what that might look like. Yeah, there's not just one thing that you do. And customized, everything needs to be really carefully thought out.
I would say, if it sounds to anyone like we actually haven't answered any questions during this conversation, it's because we haven't. Every single foundation has the
Right.
ability and the responsibility and the opportunity to create its own future, choose its own adventure. Literally, at every point, there are decisions that, even once they're made, are not permanent. You can always, with very limited exceptions, change direction, change course, make adjustments, and evolve with the needs of the community around you. And the people and the circumstances are always going to be critical factors to what the best outcome is. As long as it's compliant, there is no outcome that's better than one over another. It's really about making your foundation work in a way that is meaningful and fulfilling for you, because otherwise what is the point? You can be active in philanthropy and make an impact on the world and give money to establish charities hand over fist, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is not less than philanthropy. But if you're going to have a private foundation that allows you the ability to make these choices and be so engaged and be so hands-on, and that's what you've chosen, then it should be a gratifying and a fulfilling experience instead of, something that is a chore or a burden.
Shauna, for all those up and coming board members who are inheriting a foundation with a lot of documentation and a lot of legal understanding to have to gain, can you just do a brief touch on can documents be amended and how far and how hard is that?
So certain things can very easily be amended. So if you
Okay.
have policies like travel and expense policy or, a grant making policy or, something of that nature, that's super easy. Your board meets and everybody reviews the new version and you adopt it and everything's great. Very similar to bylaws. Bylaws can be adopted by, majority vote of the board. Sometimes it requires unanimous consent depending on the terms of your bylaws. But those changes, very easy to make, no real outside influence necessary. You do have to disclose changes to your bylaws with your tax return, but you do not have to report or provide copies of any internal documents or policies that you make adjustments to, like your investment policy or anything like that. The certificate of incorporation or your trust document are going to be a little bit harder to make amendments to. Corporate certificates of incorporation or articles of incorporation can be amended rather easily, but you do have to submit them to the Secretary of State for the state that you're incorporated in, have them stamped and filed, and then provide a copy to the IRS. For a trust, depending on the terms of the trust in the state that you're in, you may have to jump through some hoops to make changes. And it also depends on the type of change. Changes that speak to the inherent nature of the organization, its purpose, its existence, its core governing structure. Those are going to require sign off from some governing body, usually a probate court or surrogates court or some equivalent measure in at the state level. So those are the most challenging. And then if you want to leave a state, whew, the attorney generals do not like that. They don't like it when you take your money and leave the jurisdiction of their state. So for something like that, you typically have to file notification and get approval and have audits, and sometimes that process can just drag out for years. So that's something to just be aware of where you incorporate, whether the state is particularly burdensome from a regulatory and filing and reporting perspective, like New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, California have very terrible reputations, well earned, for being burdensome and
Mm.
regulatory overreach and all of those things, the audit requirements, and you have to have 3 officers and 3 directors, and people can be compensated, but they can't. Delaware. Delaware is beautiful.
That's Mecca. That's the
Delaware,
answer.
it's the corporate headquarters of the world for a reason. They have very reasonable requirements of corporate entities. They really don't engage and insert themselves too directly into the operations, and you pay $25 a year as a filing fee and send them a copy of your 990 PF and all in a day's work. So, that's something to be aware of. But if you particularly like the oversight and regulatory structure of your home state or another state, you should seek out qualified attorneys or, legal counsel that can help get your organization established and established correctly so that future generations don't
Right.
have to go
That's
through
right.
and try to, fill in gaps or, redo things that were not complete or in the best form they could be.
Thank you, Shauna. We're coming up toward the end of the hour here. And I think we've answered most questions I can see, and anything we don't get to, I do want to remind everyone that we will reach out after this webinar to answer your questions directly. But we want to thank you all for attending, and again, questions will be answered individually after the session. And the link to this recorded webinar will come to you by tomorrow. So we're most grateful, Jana. It's been a pleasure talking to you and geeking out with you on philanthropy, which we love.
Same. We
So,
don't get an opportunity to do this
no, we don't.
nearly enough. So this was really a wonderful opportunity and a nice way to spend an hour in the afternoon.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.